Boldwood presents The Housekeeper, written by Valerie Keogh and read by Rose Robinson. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. The wrought iron gates, set several feet back from the narrow country road, had seen better days. Their once lustrous black corroded in places, as if the gate was edged in rot. Ivy and bramble crawled from the hedgerow on both sides, slithering and twisting around the upright and cross bars. The vicious tangle of greenery filled the gaps and hid what lay behind from curious eyes. The gates were locked. A chain, far heavier than was surely necessary, bound them together, winding around and around as if to be sure, as if to be absolutely certain they'd hold it tight. The ends were secured with an incongruously large padlock. It was oddly shiny, and at first glance, seeing it nestled among the ivy, a passerby might be reminded of a long-forgotten Christmas decoration on an abandoned tree. It was only on a second glance, when they'd reached for it and had their skin pierced by bramble thorns, when they'd pulled their hand back to suck the bubble of blood, that they'd look again and see that the metal didn't shine as much as glint, with almost malevolent intent. If they weren't warned away, if they were still consumed with curiosity to know what lay behind, they'd look up and shake their heads. The gates may have seen better days, but the finials that edged the concave curve at the top of each still appeared pointed, as if they'd been honed razor-sharp. They were enough to deter the adventurous, the curious or the merely stupid, from climbing over. Nobody was getting into the grounds of the old house. But perhaps that wasn't the idea. Maybe it was to stop anything, all the secrets, from getting out. Chapter 1. Cassie Macreddin had left her London home early to make her 9 o'clock appointment with the estate agent in Hindon. She'd made allowances for rush-hour traffic and added extra time to negotiate the unknown winding country roads in Wiltshire. The journey had gone without mishap, and, as a result, she'd arrived far too early. A sign advertising takeaway coffee caught her eye, and she hurriedly indicated and pulled in. Inside, she resisted the sad selection of pastries and ordered a large cappuccino. She sat in her car to sip it and watch the time click by. When the disposable cup was empty, she got out and tossed it into a nearby bin. It was still too early, but there was no point in hanging around the garage when she could be investigating the village she might soon be calling home. Feeling a mix of anxiety and excitement, she drove on. She'd looked at Street View on Google Maps. The reality, as was often the way, was prettier. Honey-coloured houses, pollarded lime trees, a church steeple. All picture-book perfect. There was a parking space directly outside the estate agent's office. She pulled into it, turned off the engine and sat for a moment, looking around before climbing out. Shivering a little in the early morning breeze that drifted along the wide street, she glanced at the back seat where she'd thrown her jacket a few hours earlier. Instead of reaching for it, she wrapped her arms across her chest and crossed to the window to examine the property photographs on display. It was a relief to see that the house she was interested in wasn't among them. Since she'd found it on the internet 2 weeks previously, she'd been terrified in case someone else might see it, fall in love with it as she had done, and outbid her. It was the one. She'd looked at the details of so many properties over the previous 2 months and was beginning to think she'd never find what she was looking for. And then, there it was. An old house, tick. Detached, tick. In need of extensive repair and redecoration. Tick, tick. She'd pored over the photographs, enlarged the floor plans, pored over them, imagined knocking down walls, extending the kitchen. She'd almost been tempted to put in an offer based on the extensive details she'd read on the website. Almost tempted, but although Cassie was a lot of things, she wasn't stupid. Or at least, she qualified with a smile. Not about property. Her appointment with the agent was for 9. At 5:02, she looked up the street and saw a besuited, thin man hurrying towards her. "Cassie Macreddin?" he said, extending his hand as he reached her side. "Yes, good morning," she said, shuffling the bag and the papers she held to take the hand that was hovering between them. "I'm not who you were expecting to meet," he said, surprising her. He pulled a huge bunch of keys from his jacket pocket, inserted one into the office door, and pushed it open. Immediately, there was the beep-beep of a security alarm. "Hang on a sec." 2 long strides took him to the control panel. He tapped in a series of numbers, turning to wave her in as the beeping stopped. "Come in, please." He indicated a chair for her to take and took the one on the other side of the desk. "I'm Chris Baker. You were expecting my partner, Joe Major. Unfortunately, he won't be in today." Disappointment hit Cassie like a physical blow. She could feel her hopes and dreams bounce away. "I should explain," Baker said, running a hand over his face. "You'll have to excuse me, it's been a bit of a shock. Joe had a heart attack early this morning. He's in hospital in Bath. His wife says he's going to be okay." "Good. That's good." Cassie tried to sound sympathetic. It was hard. She didn't know the man. She was glad he was doing well, obviously, but she was more concerned with how his condition was going to impact on her plans. She wasn't a selfish woman, but she had her heart set on getting this house, and any delay might capsize that dream. All she wanted was for one damn thing to go her way. Was it too much to ask for? "Unfortunately, by the time I'd gathered my thoughts, it was too late to contact you to let you know," Baker said. "I knew you were coming from London, so I thought it was best to meet you here." Cassie relaxed a little. Maybe the day wasn't going to be a disaster after all. "Okay, so you're going to show me around the property, yes?" Baker huffed a frustrated sigh. "I wish I could, I really do. Unfortunately, I'm tied up all morning. If you could wait, I do have time late afternoon." Late afternoon? She only had the one day off work, so she needed to get home, but leaving Hindon that late would bring her back to London in the thick of rush hour. Always a nervous driver. After the accident, she'd been worse. That morning, a crippling fear had her clenching the steering wheel with such painful intensity that her fingers had been cramped by the time she'd arrived. Maybe it would get easier. "That's not going to work for me, I'm afraid. I need to get back to the city this afternoon." A ripple of annoyance slid over her when she saw his lips narrow. She knew before he spoke that he was going to apologize and ask her to come another day. She held up a hand to stop him. "I really need to see the property today. I have another few that I'm looking at, and I've promised to let the other vendors know before the end of the week." It was a lie, but he wouldn't know that. "I'm really sorry," he said, and did manage to look suitably apologetic. "There's nothing I can do, I'm afraid." Cassie wanted to reach across the desk, grab his shiny blue tie, and strangle him with it. It's been on the market for a long time. I'm sure the vendors would like to get it sold. He shrugged off her comment. It's a repossession. The previous owners bought it almost 2 years ago. They did some work on it, then went bust before finishing. The bank isn't in any great rush to sell. But she was in a rush to buy. I've come all this way. I really don't want to leave without seeing it. Could I go on my own? I've seen all the details on your website. I just need to get a feel for the place to see if it would suit. You told Joe you were thinking of starting up a B&B, is that right? Yes. The property is in the right location. It'd be ideal. It had been a dream for a long time. Chuck the stultifyingly boring job in the civil service. Get out of London. Start afresh. It was ironic how the circumstances that had almost ended her life were responsible for making the dream possible. We don't usually allow clients to go alone, he said. His expression was giving nothing away, but Cassie took heart from the usually and held her breath. The last owners left it in a bit of a mess, he said. One of his thin hands was resting flat on the desk. He tapped the middle finger rhythmically as he stared at her. Perhaps it helped his thought processes. She tried to portray herself as the solid, dependable type, the kind of person you could trust to look around a house unescorted. There are floorboards up in some of the rooms. She sensed he was giving way, but she wasn't there yet. I don't need to go into the rooms, really. It's the outside of the house that I'm keen to see. The condition and size of the gardens, where the outhouses sit, etc. Baker nodded. It is difficult to see how extensive it is from the photos. It seemed best to say nothing. Let the pros and cons tick in the estate agent's head. Cassie's hand was resting on her lap. She crossed her middle and first fingers, making a wish, like a child. It's an exceptional circumstance, Baker said. Abruptly, almost as if he was afraid he'd change his mind, he got to his feet and crossed to a desk on the other side of the office. He pulled open a drawer and fumbled in it, pulling out various bunches of keys to peer at the labels attached. Finally, he gave a grunt of satisfaction and returned to his desk. He held the bunch out, then hesitated as it dangled over Cassie's outstretched hand. It's just unfortunate that you can't wait till this afternoon. I'd be happy to show you around then. Cassie's fingers closed around the cold metal and tugged slightly till he had no option but to release them. I'll be fine, honestly. Baker didn't appear convinced. He nodded towards the keys. They're all labelled. The smaller one is for the padlock on the main gate. I haven't been out for a while. It might need a bit of jigging to get it to open. The road to Hindon House is straightforward. He pointed to where her car was parked outside. You're facing the right direction. Follow the high street from the village. I will warn you, he said with his first smile, that it's quite narrow. When you pass the national speed limit sign, take the next turn right. The property is about half a mile down that narrow road. Keep an eye for the gate. It'll be on your left. You can't miss it. Cassie hated when people said that. Invariably, she did miss whatever it was, and it made her feel twice as stupid, as if everyone but her wouldn't have done. Her fingers closed over the keys. It didn't matter. She would find it, and it'd be perfect, and everything would go to plan. And everything that had happened, everything she'd done, none of it would matter anymore. Her fingers tightened painfully on the keys. Chapter 2. Cassie leaned forward as she drove, hands clutching the steering wheel. She drove slowly, slower still when she reached the speed limit sign, until she saw the road to the right. Indicating, she turned down a road so narrow she hoped not to meet something coming in the opposite direction. 1/2 mile, the agent had said. She checked her mileometer and crawled along, eyes straining to see a gap in the high hedge that edged the road. She didn't precisely miss the gate, but had passed it by before realizing. It wasn't surprising. It was set several feet back from the road and had been almost swallowed by the hedgerow on either side. On the narrow country road, there was no space to turn. Putting the car into reverse, she slowly backed up and pulled into the semicircle in front of the gate. The ground was carpeted in daisies, dandelions, and a mix of grasses that were probably from seed blown in on the wind from nearby farms. The grasses swayed gently in the breeze, daisies nodded, and downy white parachutes sailed upward from the gone-to-seed dandelions. Cassie lowered her window. Her first thought was how idyllic it was. Her second, that it looked as if the wrought iron gate hadn't been opened in a long, long time. She was struck by the idea that the encroaching ivy and bramble was trying to drag the iron back into the ground from whence it had come. Prone to flights of fancy as she was, this one made her smile. The ivy might not have succeeded in dragging the gate downward, but it did make it impossible to see through to the house and the land that lay behind. She switched off the engine and climbed out. The silence was broken only by the twittering of birds. It sounded as if the hedgerow was filled with them. Her plan was to run a country house B&B, a retreat. Birdsong was the ideal soundtrack for it. So far, she thought, so absolutely perfect. Ivy had coiled around the padlock and chain. She tore it away, grimacing when woodlice scampered over the metal. The bunch of keys was in her pocket. She pulled it out and searched through it for the smallest one. When the woodlice appeared reluctant to vacate their home, she pulled a leaf from the ivy to sweep them away and inserted the key into the lock before they'd a chance to return. She'd expected to have to struggle. The click, as it opened, loud enough to startle birds on both sides, a flurry of sparrows rising and moving in a noisy twitter, to vanish into a spot further along the hedge. Tossing the padlock to the ground, Cassie tugged at the chain to separate it from the tendrils of ivy and other plants that had wound round it. When, finally, it was free, she dropped it on the ground beside the lock. It quickly dawned on Cassie that getting the lock and chain off had been the easy bit. Between the ivy and brambles that had wrapped themselves around the bars and the weeds that had grown at the base on both sides, the gates were stuck fast. Cassie used her feet to flatten sycamore saplings and seedlings, and was grateful she was wearing trousers as she kicked down tall stinging nettles. The edge of one of the bigger keys proved to be a useful tool to split the ivy stems that seemed determined to prevent her entry. The brambles were more difficult, their thorns piercing her skin as she tried to lever them away. It was hard, dirty work. By the time she felt one of the two gates give a little, she was hot and sweaty, and multiple scratches and thorn pricks decorated her hands and arms. She refused to give up, though. Digging her heels in, she gripped the edge of the gate, put her weight behind it, and pulled. As soon as the gap was wide enough, she squeezed sideways through it. "Damn it," she said, when her t-shirt caught on a bramble. It took a few seconds and more thorn damage to her fingers before she was able to release it. She was sucking a drop of blood from her thumb when she finally turned to look towards the house. Despite the metallic taste of blood in her mouth and the stinging pain from the punctures and scratches, her lips curved in a relieved smile. Overgrown bushes lined the weed-strewn driveway as it snaked its way to the house a quarter of a mile ahead. Between the bushes and the hedgerow that made up the boundary to the land, saplings and tall weeds flourished. It didn't look as if the people who'd bought it 2 years before had done any work on the grounds. According to the estate agent's details, the last time the house had been occupied for more than a couple of years at a time had been 10 years before that. In the absence of care, the grounds had reverted to wilderness. As she walked along, her mind was whirring with ideas. She was giving herself 6 months to do the necessary renovations and decorating. By that time, she'd need to start earning money. The gardens would take forever. Perhaps she could use it as a selling point, in a similar way to the lost gardens of Heligan in Cornwall. On a far smaller scale, of course, but it might be worth considering. It would be good to have things to think about. It would help to chase the demons away. She needed to keep them away if she'd any hope of making a new life. Chapter 3. Because of the overgrown trees surrounding the house, Cassie didn't get a good view until she was almost upon it. The driveway ended in a semicircle, the house lying along its flat edge. Some attempt had obviously been made by the previous purchasers to clear the weeds. It made it easier to imagine how it must have looked in its heyday. More importantly, how it could look again. Early Victorian, the 3-story mansion had been built for a wealthy social climbing wool merchant. He'd obviously been determined to make a statement. From the stone steps that led up to a very grand, imposing front door, to the 2 elegant bay windows on each side, and the rows of windows on the upper floor, everything screamed, "Look at me." She stood staring. This could be it. This could work. Wasn't this exactly what she'd wanted? What she'd dreamt about for so long? But she'd never expected to be doing it alone. Richie should be here with her. They should be standing hand in hand, facing their future together. She swallowed the lump in her throat, pushed back the guilt, forced herself to concentrate on the grand house in front of her. The idea that there was less work to do than she'd expected faded as she crossed the semicircle to the steps leading to the front door. Close to, she could see the window frames on each side were badly rotten, the glass in most of them intact but cracked. All the windows had shutters, and when she peered from the steps down to the lower ground floor level, she could see that the windows there were barred. Such security seemed excessive in such a rural setting. She'd read about the history of the house. Over the years, it had gone from being a private home to, at various times, a convent, a school, a rehabilitation centre during the last war, and then back to a private home. It had changed. She wondered which of its owners was so afraid of being burgled that they'd felt the need to put bars on the windows. Removing them would be added to her list of things to do. Continuing up the steps to the front door, she was pleased to see this was in good repair. It possibly wasn't the original, but it was in keeping with the house. It wouldn't need to be replaced, and every penny would need to count. Taking out the bunch of keys, she shuffled them to find the one labelled front door. The lock, too, was in good condition, and the key turned with ease. Cassie took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Despite not being original, it was old, and she wouldn't have been surprised if it had squeaked or creaked. Neither sound would have startled her or have sent goosebumps running over her skin. What did unsettle her, though, was the soft, sibilant shush the door made as it slid over the floor behind. A whisper, as if to warn her of something. It brought Cassie to a halt with her hand on the door, her body half turned as if to flee. Fear seemed to be her instant reaction to everything these days. She shook her head in part acknowledgement of how silly she was being, part recognition of how damaged she still was by what had happened. It had been 6 months since the accident that had killed her husband. She'd walked free, without as much as a scratch. Her friends said she was suffering survivor's guilt, but then her friends didn't know the truth about what had happened that day. It wasn't something she could tell. Unfortunately, she couldn't let it go either, and it stayed inside, curdled and sour. Sometimes she worried that it would taint everything she had planned. Could she really build a happy life based on such a shattered and shaky foundation? Once again, Cassie forced her thoughts back to the present. There wasn't time for nonsense. Gritting her teeth, she pushed the door fully open and stepped inside. The entrance hall was large and probably would have been very elegant and inviting. Time, and the previous owners, had taken a heavy toll. One wall was covered in fuzzy black mould, hinting at a leak from somewhere above. Either it hadn't been sorted last time, or it had occurred since stepping closer. The wall was so wet, it almost glistened. The agent had been right. It wasn't the safest of places. Floorboards had been taken up in several places and not replaced. Possibly when they were doing the rewiring or plumbing or something. No doubt it would all become clear. The cantilevered stairway that ran from the hall to the upper floor looked to be intact. Before heading up, she investigated the other rooms on this level. A huge one on the right, with windows to the front and to the rear, was littered with broken furniture, piles of floorboards, tins of paint and other paraphernalia. But there wasn't, she was pleased to see, any sign of damp here. The room on the other side wasn't so lucky. It was on the other side of the mouldy wall and shared the same problem. Otherwise, it was in a similar state as the other. All kinds of rubbish had been dumped in it. She'd have to hire a skip to get rid of it all. Pound signs were flashing in front of her eyes as she climbed the stairs to the upper floor, where there were 5 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. Her plan was to make all the rooms en suite. Although it would cost a hefty amount, it was necessary if she wanted to attract high-paying customers. All the rooms were a mess, but structurally, they were okay. It was in the last room, the bathroom, where she found the problem. And she'd been right. It was a new problem, or at least it hadn't predated the previous owners. They'd caused it. The bathroom had been gutted, the fixtures disconnected. The house was connected to mains water and it had been turned off, so she wasn't sure how one pipe was dripping. Only a drop every few seconds. It was enough, over the previous 2 years, to have caused chaos. It was a case of shutting the stable door after the horse had vanished over the hills. But there was a bucket nearby with nothing else to do, so she stuck it under the pipe. Back on the ground floor, she opened a door under the stairway and headed down to the lower ground floor. She found herself in a small, dim hallway. To one side, a corridor stretched ahead, disappearing into the darkness. She took a few steps along it, stopping to peer into the first room. A tiny space, jammed with all sorts of junk. Tables, chairs, beds, the rubbish of years. A grim little room. Dark, too, the little light coming through the small windows further dulled by the security bars. Cassie folded her arms across her chest and shivered. Not even the recent good weather had managed to dispel the lingering, damp, dreary sadness that seemed to cling to the walls. Back in the corridor, she looked along its length, seeing pockets of light in the darkness that hinted at more rooms. She wasn't risking going further. If they were all the same as this one, there was no hurry to explore them. Back in the small hallway, she pushed open the door opposite. It led to another corridor, but this time she nodded in satisfaction. According to the estate agent details, this part of the lower ground floor had been used for domestic staff accommodation. It was where Cassie planned to have her living quarters. All it took was to remove all the accumulated junk and knock down a few walls. Easy. She was smiling when she returned to the hall to open the final door into the kitchen. The room was a dated, higgledy-piggledy mess. Windows overlooking the rear garden were too small to let in much light. It needed French windows to brighten the room. It was small for what she wanted, too. With her hands on her hips, she eyed the back wall. If that could come down, and the walls dividing the small, useless rooms behind were removed, this would be a fabulous space, with light coming from both sides. She could imagine it. A big, fancy kitchen, a huge table for when friends visited, a comfy seating area with a TV. The other space could be converted into 2 bedrooms and a huge luxury bathroom. She hugged herself. It was going to be absolutely perfect. There was a key on the bunch she held to open the back door. Outside, outhouses stretched along one side of a dusty yard. She realised then why the gate had been so hard to open. There was another access here. It wasn't locked and opened easily. Irritation flared. Why hadn't the estate agent directed her to this gate? Then she remembered it was his partner who'd been supposed to show her around. Perhaps Chris Baker didn't know about this access gate. It was annoying. She could have driven right in. Next time. And she knew there'd be one, because despite requiring more, it was the perfect house for her. On the other side of the yard, she saw what might have been a kitchen garden at one time. And behind that, an orchard, the trees already laden with fruit. She couldn't see the boundary of the land. There was plenty to explore. But not that day. The agent had said it was a repossession and was being sold by the bank. She'd make a low cash offer, citing the leak and the extensive renovations required as a reason to justify it. It had been on the market for almost 2 years. The price had been dropped twice in that time. She couldn't see them rejecting her offer. If it went to plan, she could be the owner in less than a month. Get the work started. Make that damn dream come true. She'd make it come true if she had to kill someone to do it. After all, hadn't she done that already? Chapter 4. The low offer Cassie made for Hindon House was rejected. She offered the asking price and sat chewing the nails of one hand, the fingers of the other curled around the phone, waiting for it to ring. When it did, she yelped, then took a deep breath to calm herself before answering. She wasn't sure if the estate agent was convinced by her casual air, as if she didn't care, as if this didn't mean absolutely everything to her. "They've accepted your offer," Chris Baker said. "Subject, as you'd insisted, to a structural survey." She'd debated not bothering with having one done and saving the cost. It would have been a foolish step to have missed, though. The house was in poor repair. She needed to make sure it was structurally sound and wasn't going to fall around her ears. It took a further week to get the survey done. According to the detailed report she'd commissioned, the house was solid, built on a stone, mortar and compacted clay foundation, which would have been typical of the time. This, they suggested, may need to be reinforced with concrete. As she'd discovered herself, the cause of the damp to the walls downstairs was caused by that one stupid dripping pipe. There was no other sign of damp. They did list a catalogue of problems, but all were ones she already knew about, and none made her change her mind about the purchase. And then, it was hers. The first step in getting the future she'd longed for. She printed out any emails that came and added them to a growing folder of documentation in her determination to keep everything straight. Her late husband, Richie, had been the organiser, the one who would pore over documents, checking details, dotting every I, crossing every damn T until she was fit to scream. She hadn't, though. Not till that last day. And because of that, she was now the one doing the dotting and crossing, the checking and double-checking. The dream designed for two had become a solo option. As soon as the contracts were signed and exchanged, and she was the new owner of Hindon House, Cassie handed in her notice. The same job since she'd left school. All her working life. 20 years. How mind-bogglingly boring. She could have moved into the private sector as so many others had done. Perhaps she would have done, if she hadn't met Richie. 10 years they'd been married. Happy years, mostly. She'd expected to have children. When they didn't come, she readjusted without much difficulty. She had. Richie hadn't. It was he who'd pushed for the tests. He who'd been devastated when it turned out it was his fault, if any fault was going to be assigned. It never had been, by her. He, on the other hand, bemoaned his low sperm count and the lack of vigour in the few he had, constantly referring to himself as a failure, less than a man, as if the lack of those wriggly little buggers had emasculated him. And nothing she could do or say made a difference. It came down to a simple truth. He was desperate to have children. She wasn't. But she loved him and went through the multiple rounds of IVF, where they'd taken one of his more determined buggers and inserted it into her accommodating egg, and then plopped the resulting mini-babe back into her nursery. As it happened, it seemed her nursery wasn't the safest place to put the budding babe, because she lost it each time. And then he'd wanted more tests, more invasive procedures, more IVF. But after having had the first 3 attempts on the National Health Service, now they needed to pay. Using their savings, money they'd been saving for so many years for the dream they'd had as newlyweds. To allow them to, or maybe even a small hotel. To work for themselves. It was what kept her going when life seemed grim. It was what had mattered when Richie's obsession with having children began to impact on their relationship, damaging it, damaging them. Worse, she saw him looking at other women, wondering if they could give him what he wanted. She hung on, clinging to memories of how it had been, how it still could be. Because she loved him. And he loved her. Until he didn't. Chapter 5. Cassie put her small apartment on the market the same day she handed in her notice. It had always been her plan to camp out in Hindon House while she was doing the renovations. The sale of her apartment would free up the money she'd need to pay for them. It sold on the first day. To her relief, the new owner, who was planning to rent it out, was happy to buy all the furniture Cassie was willing to sell. "Everything," she'd said bluntly. She was starting anew. She didn't want anything to remind her of the past. As soon as she'd worked her last day, she packed up all her carefully coordinated suits and blouses and dropped them all to a local charity shop. Any gold jewellery she'd acquired over the 15 years she'd been with Richie, the 10 years they were married, the 5 years before, was taken to a jeweller and sold. At the last minute, she slipped her wedding and engagement ring from her finger. With the weight she'd lost in the previous few months, they came away easily, and she dropped them onto the counter with the rest. "You don't think you're taking things to extremes?" her friend Tony said over a glass of wine in a pub they favoured, not because it was a particularly nice place, but because it was an easy stroll from where both lived. Cassie swirled the ice around in her G&T and took a long drink before answering. She'd been tempted to buy a bottle of gin after the accident. Several bottles. If she had, she'd have drunk it neat in her desperation to forget. She'd got as far as loading a trolley in her local supermarket, bottles of their cheapest gin clinking together as she pushed it towards the checkout. There was a long queue. She found herself staring into the trolley and wondering if she could open one of the bottles there and then, guzzle it while she was waiting and start that. The need was so strong. It frightened her. Leaving the trolley where it was, she headed for the exit. Since then, she'd kept her drinking for nights like this, when she was with friends who'd make sure she didn't sink too low. It was the downside of moving from the city. She'd miss her friends. Ignoring Tony's comment, she said, "You'll have to come down, spend a few days. I really could do with your flair to get the interior design just right." It was the perfect thing to say to her uber-stylish friend, and soon they were deep in discussion of the best decor to suggest country house chic. "When are you planning on moving down?" Tony asked. "Next week. I packed most of what I was bringing and brought it down last weekend, so there's not much left to go. The new owner of the apartment bought all the furniture, which made it so much easier." She'd also bought some of the paintings and knickknacks Cassie and Richie had collected over the years, and what wasn't wanted was donated to a local charity shop. It was brutal, but necessary. Telling Tony would start a conversation Cassie didn't want, so she didn't bother. "There's no point in delaying when there's so much to do. I've organised for the hire of a portaloo until I can get the plumbing sorted." Tony's mouth dropped open. "You've no plumbing? A portaloo? Are you kidding me?" Cassie grinned. "Afraid not. You still coming?" "I don't mind roughing it, Cass, but that's taking things to a different level." "I'm teasing you. I don't expect you to come down yet. Give me a few weeks to get the basics sorted. I'll need your help when it comes to choosing paint, wallpaper, stuff like that. You've such good taste, and I want it to look right." "I'll be down, don't fret. Louise, too," she added, mentioning their mutual friend. "And when you're ready to take guests, we're planning to be the first." Cassie might have made a mess of a lot of things, but she'd chosen her friends well. Reaching over, she planted a loud smack on Tony's cheek. "You're the best, you know that?" "We've been friends a long time, Cass. We'll always be there for you when you need us." As she had done, for months, and they'd never complained. She'd like to think she'd have the opportunity to return the favour, but her two closest friends seemed to lead charmed lives. That, or most of them, anyway. When it came to it, when she'd really had to, she'd managed to hide exactly what she'd done. "I'll miss having you nearby," she said. And she would. They lived so close to each other, not a week went by that she hadn't seen them at least once. They'd come and visit, of course, but it wouldn't be the same. Tony, always the more pragmatic of the three, shrugged. "You'll make more friends there, broaden your horizons. Country people are friendlier than city dwellers. You'll soon have a new network of friends." "Yes, of course I will." Cassie wasn't so sure. The locals might resent her buying up the big house, moving in and making changes. The proprietors of the Lamb Hotel in Hindon might resent the competition. She'd looked at the rooms on their website and had been impressed with the way the 12th century inn had been decorated. It was exactly what she'd dreamed of for her B&B. There was room for both, wasn't there? She hadn't intended on doing evening meals, so she could direct her customers to the Lamb. Perhaps even offer a lift there and back. She made a mental note to give that idea more consideration in the future. It could work very well. She'd tread carefully and not make waves. Unless she had to. The one thing she'd discovered about herself in the last few months was that she was made of tougher stuff than she'd imagined. More than people, even her friends, gave her credit for. Chapter 6. On Cassie's final day in London, the last day of her old life, her closest friends, Louise and Tony, came to see her off. They found her flapping around in a panic. "I thought everything remaining would fit in the boot of the car." She nudged the box on the floor beside her with the toe of her shoe. "This is the rest of the stuff from the kitchen cupboards, and I'd thought they were almost empty." Tony laughed. "There's always more than you think. If you can't manage to squeeze it in, I can take it and bring it down when I come." Cassie shook her head. Having really no idea what was jammed into the other boxes, she didn't want to leave anything behind. "I'll make it fit. Squash stuff on the back seat, the passenger seat, and the footwells." With her friends helping, every spare inch of space was used to load what remained. It took, and then they were done. "Are you sure you can see out the rear?" Louise asked, walking to the back of the car to peer through the window. Cassie sat into the driver's seat and adjusted the rearview mirror. "Yes, it's fine, honestly. I'll take my time. Drive slowly." She saw the sympathetic smile on both her friends' faces. They thought she was so brave, driving again after the accident, getting on with a life without Richie. She liked the version of herself she saw in their eyes. Would it change if they knew the truth? Pushing that thought away, she got out of the car, reached an arm around both women, and pulled them into a group hug. "Right, before you soppy pairs start bawling, I'll head off." Back in the driver's seat, she shut the car door and opened the window. "Thanks, girls. You're the best friends I could ask for." If she wasn't careful, she'd start bawling. Maybe even climb out and say she wasn't going, that this was a crazy idea. She'd seen that thought in their eyes when she'd shown them the photographs she'd taken of Hindon House. What they didn't know was that she'd shown them the best of it, not the worst. When they'd suggested travelling to Wiltshire to see the house in the flesh, she'd put them off. They'd have been horrified at the magnitude of what she was undertaking. They might have made the doubts in her head take form and grow. Might even have made her change her mind. They might have tried to persuade her that it was grief making her flee from London. They'd never have understood the truth. That it was guilt, not grief, that steered her ship. Worse, it wasn't guilt over what had happened, over what she had made happen. No. It was guilt for finally making her dream come true. Her friends were leaning against the car, peering through the open window. "Watch out for those ruggedly handsome countrymen," Tony said. Louise laughed and thumped her arm. "She's going to Wiltshire, not Alaska." "Same difference," said the confirmed city girl. She leaned through the window and planted a kiss on Cassie's cheek. "Go carefully. Let us know when you get there and send lots more photos of the house when you can." "Yes, and ones of the garden too," Louise said, pushing Tony aside and reaching through to give Cassie's arm a squeeze. She hid a smile. If she sent photographs of the jungle that surrounded that, "I'll send so many photos you'll be sick of them." "Never. Keep them coming," Tony said. The two friends stood back, arms around each other's waist. "We'll miss you," they said in perfect unison. "And I'll miss you both." With a final wave, Cassie drove from the car park and started her journey. She left London far later than she'd planned, and, typically, the traffic on the way out of the city was worse than usual. An hour into the journey, the sky darkened, and the rain started, a deluge that hammered on her windscreen. Even on their highest setting, the windscreen wipers struggled to cope. Since the crash, every time she'd driven, she'd felt a simmering tension. She'd thought it was getting easier with each journey, but now, faced with the rain, it exploded into fear. Straining against the seatbelt, she leaned forward, peering through the rain-washed windscreen to look for somewhere to stop. In desperation, she indicated and pulled into the driveway of a house and turned off the engine. Resting her head on the steering wheel, she took a deep breath. It didn't help. She needed to get out. A glance towards the house told her someone was home, the lights of a TV flickering in a downstairs room. She should move on, but she couldn't. She felt suddenly hemmed in by the crush of stuff packed around her, by the rain on the windows, by the claustrophobic feeling of being trapped. She flung open the car door, her fingers struggling to undo the seatbelt. And then she was out. Within seconds, the long-sleeved cotton shirt she wore was soaked through. She shut the car door to turn out the interior light and stood leaning against the car, letting the rain beat down on her, the heavy drops ricocheting off the wet fabric of her shirt. It was several minutes before she felt able to climb back in. The fear hadn't gone away. She wasn't sure it ever would. But she'd manage it. She had to. Had to get a grip. She reached into a bag jammed into the footwell of the passenger seat, pulled out a sweatshirt and used it to wipe the rain from her face and hair. A quick change into a dry t-shirt, and she was back on the road. The rain didn't let up for the remainder of the journey. By the time she arrived in Hindon, her shoulders ached from stress, and the 100-mile journey, which should have taken 2 hours, had taken almost 4. It wasn't the best start to the rest of her life. It was almost dark when she turned into the narrow lane that led to the gate at the back of the property. On her first visit as owner, she'd pulled away weeds that prevented it from opening smoothly, and now, in the driving rain, it was a moment's work to open the gate wide and drive through. She left it open, drove to the back of the house, and parked as close to the door as she could. All she needed was her handbag and mobile. Everything else could remain in the car. It would mean getting up early in the morning to unpack before her 9 o'clock meeting with a local building company, but she couldn't face doing it now. She had to hope that by the morning, the rain would have stopped. Hopefully, she muttered, slamming the car door behind her and pressing the fob to lock it. The clunk was loud in the silence. When the interior light of her car switched out, the sudden and complete darkness